Hi, I'm Matt and welcome to a new episode of How To. Today we've got a special guest, Evan. He's going to tell us how to build some terrain.
Hi, absolutely. So just using a few basic materials to get from craft stores and a hardware store, I've built a few interchangeable panels that you can move around to make it different every time you play. Basically you start with your piece of timber, then you need to prime it so that everything will stick to it properly and not just soak into it. Once you've got it primed, it's best to figure out where you want major things to be. I mean, the downside of making terrain like this is all permanent, but if you make it in pieces, you can then interchange them and it's not so bad. Having them permanent means they're much more stable and they're usually a bit more durable. So you start with, well, at least I started with chunks of styrofoam, like things like that you can get from craft stores. Tear it up into the chunks that you want, whatever sizes you want, arrange them, glue them down with PVA glue, leave it a while to set, like 12 hours, 24 hours, because PVA glue, it soaks into the foam and it has a lot of moisture in it, so it needs time to dry. Just keep checking it while you're doing it, make sure it's not moving out of place or anything. Once the styrofoam is down, I cover it with plaster bandages. Just really easy way of making sure that they've got nice smooth contours. It doesn't look like chunks of styrofoam, it looks something more natural. And then over the top of the plaster bandages, once they've dried, you can either leave it like as the bandages, because that does give really good texture to it, very sort of grainy and sandy, or as I've done for the rock faces on these sides and all over this piece, is I cover it in tin foil, which allows you to give it a sort of flat but wrinkled organic rock look. The tricky part with tin foil is paint doesn't like to stick to it, so you need to use a primer first over the tin foil so that you've got a base to then continue painting. So then you get your colours, mix them up to whatever rock colours you want, paint them on, and then I find after that it's good to do an ink wash. So as you can see, we'll show you close up later, but along the faces here, the ink wash will settle into all the crevices and give it a look that looks like actual rock, at least I think it does. Mind you, I made this, but anyway. This table is nearly complete, because after I did the rocks, I then worked out where I wanted the paths to be. This entire rock is pretty much unfinished. You can still see patches of plaster bandage showing through. You can see bits of the tin foil still. So this is as far as I got with this table.
So look at this side for an idea of where we're going for.
Yeah, absolutely.
So today we're going to be building a new board from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to be taking us through the process of how to do it.
Yep, absolutely. The very first thing I did to the table was prime it with house primer. This really cheap small tin of house primer from a hardware store. It's like $10 and it covers about 6 of these panels, if not more. Really useful. Something else that's really handy when you're working with styrofoam is and I'll try to not cut myself with this, a very sharp hobby knife. So I'm fairly happy with the shape of this. I'm going to round it off with bits of plaster bandage and such once it's down, but I do want to rough it up a little bit because it's a little bit too perfect at this point. And honestly, to me, you don't need to be precise with this, so I'm just going to start hacking little bits off it and we'll see what we get. It doesn't have to be amazing, because once you get the plaster bandages down on it, you can really start to change its shape, change its appearance, and add a lot of depth to it. Okay. Yeah, that looks like a pretty good start to me. So, start getting a bit of PVA glue under this. Precision is not necessary for this stage. This is the quick, messy bit where you're just getting all the components into place before you really start to refine it. I'm already pretty happy with those two there. Again, they have some really flat sides to them, but I can fix that with the plaster bandages once we get to that stage. You don't want anything too perfectly geometric like this square. That will look really obvious, but again, I could snap that in half and rough it up a bit. And rocks like this for 40k are really good for blocking line of sight, which is a big part of the game. So it's really handy having stuff like that on a board. Of course, I could leave it completely clear and just use the centerpiece, and then you could place your own terrain on it. But I like having this theme and completing it to a theme. I think I'll start doing around the main part. This gives it that little bit more character and authenticity. Now I'm fairly happy with these rocks where they are. So I think I'll start attaching them to the table as well. Now, as for the rest of the table, I don't want it to just be plain and flat. While that is better for the game, aesthetically I prefer it to have a little bit of character to it. So, as these are drying, I'm going to figure out where I'm going to put little extra bits of, basically, be using broken up bits of cork. And eventually I think I'll put plaster bandage over most of the table, just so it looks like a rough, blasted land, with that sitting in the middle. So now we've given it a few minutes for the glue to dry a little bit. It's not necessary at this stage to let it dry entirely, because basically the next stage is to put plaster bandages over it, and that will take a while to dry regardless. So I find the best method is as if you were applying them to a person who'd broken a limb. Basically just get some water, you get the plaster bandage, you cut it down to the size that you want. This is a good starting piece just to lay over the top of it, but I am going to strip it down a little bit. Just run it through the water. Try not to get it too wet, but you want all of it to be wet so the plaster actually starts to go gooey. And then you just start laying it where you want it. And the great thing about this is while it's still wet and malleable, you can kind of shape it. You can push it in if you want it tucked in. You can shape it over things to make them look like rocks. It's very versatile and very cheap, and you can get it from most craft stores. So that's a good start, I think, for the plinth. Just keep going with that. And where they overlap, I find it best to press them into one another. And again, doing this over Styrofoam, because Styrofoam tends to absorb water so quickly, it will hold the plaster bandage to itself, so you tend not to get any separation or cracks, which is fantastic. Makes the process a lot easier. And just don't get it too wet, because you get all the plaster running off it, and then it's just basically cloth. Now we'll start doing the rocks. I'm going to tuck it in a little bit around these rocks, because some of them I want it to look like they're sitting on top of it, whereas others I'll blend in a bit more, make it look like they're coming out of the landscape. And I apologise if I'm squinting a bit. It is quite bright out here today. But I thought I'd take off my sunglasses so you can see that I have eyes and thus a soul. Okay. One last rock. Quite happy with how those are going for a start, so I'm going to start laying more strips of bandage across the rest of the table with little bits of cork under it to give it a bit of texture. I think that should about do it, don't want to overdo it. And don't be worried if you bunch it up, the bandage, because it just, again, it adds more texture, adds more character to your terrain. Maybe some broken looking walls. We just need to let this dry for a little while before we can start applying any paints to it. Otherwise it all starts getting too messy. The plaster, the water, the paint, it'll all mix, it'll all run, and it'll look terrible. So we just need to let it sit for maybe half an hour to an hour before we can start painting it. It'll be probably 24 hours before it's all completely dry, set and cured, but that's okay. We can start painting in about an hour. Okay, so now we've come back to it. The plaster is still drying. There's going to be a lot of moisture in there still being absorbed into the styrofoam. There'll still be a lot of moisture from the PVA glue, but that's fine. It's dried enough to make a bit of a crust, so now we can start applying the next layer to it, which is going to be tin foil, or aluminium foil. This will be on the rock surfaces and around the edges of this central piece. It gives it a much more rock-like texture. I prefer it to just leaving it as the bandage, and it's very easy to apply. So we'll start with this one. Just get off a decent sized piece of tin foil and kind of size it up a bit, but yeah, it should be enough. If it's not, you can always just apply more. So the slightly matte side of the tin foil, just get your PVA glue when it wants to come out. Plenty of that, because you want it to really coat the other side of it. And again, you do not have to be perfectly spot on with this. There is a lot of room for error and for fixing things. And so there's a lot of gaps around this side. I'm just going to apply some more glue to get it all to stick down. I like to try and push it into all the cracks, all little crevices, because it really highlights them once you've got the tin foil on there. Makes it look far more interesting. So for this rock, I'm scrunching it in around underneath the edges. So I want to make it look like this one is kind of overhanging a little bit. Uh-oh, running out of PVA. You will go through a lot of it doing this sort of project. Hopefully you can see this starting to take shape. So now, because the paint is going to be going on a tin foil and it doesn't really stick to that very well, I add some PVA glue to the paint. It helps it spread over the tin foil and stick. It will probably need a few coats, but that's okay. It's just a little bit more time. I think that paint might have gotten a bit old. Oh well. Texture. So as you can see, I'm just mixing it up, mixing black and white. More white than black to get a kind of grey colour. If I had some blue paint, I'd probably mix a little bit of that in as well, just to give it a slightly more stony colour. But again, you can go with whatever you like, really. Whatever suits your tastes for it, ultimately. Alright, I'll start applying it and just see how it is. I think it may be a little bit too thin, but it might work anyway. And I'm not really worried about it spilling over onto the rest of the table, because that will be covered up by other paint and by sand and things. Okay, this is going on nicely as a base coat. It is running down the sides quite a bit, but that's alright. It really doesn't matter. It's just layers to make it all stick to the tin foil. Just try and make sure you get it into all the little nooks and crannies. Okay, well this should give us a good base to work from. I'm just going to do one of the stones I've got over here as well. Okay. Alright. Now we just need to let those dry and let the rest of the plaster dry. Join me next time, or us next time, for part 2, where hopefully we'll be able to finish this all off in one more episode. Thanks for watching.